Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most spectacular genetic disasters. Tonight we're trading Roman discipline for royal dysfunction, swapping tales of military conquest for the slow motion collapse of an entire bloodline. We're diving headfirst into the Habsburg family tree, or as I like to call it, the Habsburg family pretzel, where cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and somehow nobody thought this might end badly. So before we get started on this journey through centuries of chromosomal chaos, take a moment to hit that like button if you enjoy watching me dissect the poor life choices of dead Europeans, and subscribe if you want more stories about how power, politics, and terrible decision-making created some of history's most fascinating train wrecks. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and whether your family tree has any suspicious branches. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world, hopefully with better genetics than tonight's subjects. Now, get comfortable, maybe grab a drink. Definitely lower those lights, and let's settle in for the tale of Queen Mariana of Austria and the absolute genetic catastrophe she brought into this world. We're talking about the birth of Charles II of Spain, a man so inbreed he makes your weird cousin look like a Rhodes Scholar. So you think your family reunions are awkward? Oh, sweet summer child. You clearly haven't met the Habsburgs, where family gatherings required a genealogist, a therapist, and probably a priest just to figure out who was related to whom, and in how many different ways. Tonight, we're exploring what happens when keeping it in the family becomes less of a preference and more of a genetic death spiral that took centuries to complete. Buckle up, because we're about to witness the spectacular finale of Europe's most ambitious experiment in royal inbreeding, where bloodline purity mattered more than basic human functionality, and where producing an heir became less about continuing a dynasty and more about proving that yes, genetics does have limits, and yes, the Habsburgs found every single one of them. So you think your family reunions are awkward? Try being a Habsburg. Picture this. It's 1661, and you're Mariana of Austria, Queen of Spain, staring down at the wrething, drooling mess that just emerged from your royal womb. Congratulations, Your Majesty. You've just given birth to the future King of Spain, and he looks like God's rough draft of a human being that got crumpled up and tossed in the celestial wastebasket. But let's back up, shall we? Because this story doesn't start with one unfortunate birth. Oh no, this is the grand finale of generations of spectacular genetic roulette, where the house always wins and humanity always loses. The Habsburgs didn't just stumble into producing Charles II of Spain, that walking advertisement for genetic diversity. They methodically, deliberately, obsessively crafted him through centuries of keeping it in the family. Meet the Habsburg family tree, or as historians like to call it, the Habsburg family wraith. Because when your great-great-grandfather is also your great-great-uncle, and your cousin is also your sister-in-law, and your family reunions require a flowchart just to figure out who's allowed to sit next to whom, you're not so much climbing a family tree as you are stuck in a genetic pretzel. The Habsburgs ruled Europe the way a particularly determined spider rules a web, except instead of catching flies, they caught kingdoms, duchies, and the occasional bout of hemophilia. They were the ultimate power couple, if by couple you mean an entire dynasty that treated marriage the way normal people treat a company picnic. Everyone's invited, but mostly it's just co-workers who've seen each other a little too much. Emperor Charles V, bless his genetically compromised heart, set the tone early. His parents were already cousins, because apparently the Habsburg motto was, "Why shop around when you can shop at home?" Charles himself married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal, because nothing says romance like a family tree that looks like a subway map designed by someone having a seizure. Their son, Philip II of Spain, took the family business to new heights of chromosomal chaos. Philip didn't just marry within the family, he made it an art form. His first wife was his double first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal. When she inconveniently died, as wives tend to do when they're more genetically similar to their husbands than most siblings, Philip moved on to Mary I of England. Bloody Mary, as history remembers her, though in this context, the blood might have been from all the genetic disorders they were passing around like party favors. But Philip wasn't done. Oh no, he was just getting warmed up. After Mary died childless, probably because their combined genetics had all the fertility of a salted field. Philip married Elizabeth of Valois. She managed to give him 2 daughters before dying, as was becoming a disturbing pattern in Habsburg marriages. Not to be deterred, Philip then married his niece, Anna of Austria. His niece. Let that marinate in your brain for a moment. Anna, poor soul, was not just Philip's niece but also his cousin. Because the Habsburgs had turned family relations into a geometric puzzle that would make Euclid weep, she was the daughter of Philip's sister Maria and his cousin Maximilian too. So when Philip married Anna, he was essentially playing genetic Jenga with the building blocks of human DNA. And Anna, bless her inbred heart, delivered. She gave Philip 5 children, including the future Philip II, who would continue the grand Habsburg tradition of marrying relatives with the enthusiasm of a stamp collector pursuing a rare misprint. Philip III married Margaret of Austria, who was, surprise surprise, his cousin. Margaret's parents were Charles Tyr of Austria and Maria Anna of Bavaria. Charles I of Austria was the son of Ferdinand I, who was the brother of Charles V, who was Philip II's great-grandfather. If you're keeping track at home, congratulations, you're now qualified to work for the Habsburg genealogy department. Margaret and Philip II had 8 children, though only 5 survived to adulthood, which was actually considered a rousing success by Habsburg standards. Their son Philip IV would become the father of our main character, the infamous Charles II. But before we get to that particular genetic disaster, let's talk about Philip IV's romantic choices. Philip IV married Elizabeth of France, who was, naturally, his cousin. Elizabeth's mother was Anna of Austria, the same Anna who had married her uncle Philip II. So Elizabeth was Philip IV's first cousin once removed, and also his second cousin, and also related to him in about 17 other ways that would require a team of genealogists and a very large whiteboard to properly explain. Elizabeth gave Philip IV several children, but most died young, as Habsburg children had a disturbing tendency to do. This wasn't coincidence. This was genetics operating with the efficiency of a well-oiled killing machine. When you're working with a gene pool that's more like a gene puddle, survival becomes a luxury item. After Elizabeth died, Philip IV married Mariana of Austria, and here's where our story really gets interesting. Mariana wasn't just any Austrian archduchess, she was Philip IV's niece, his brother Ferdinand IV's daughter. So when Philip IV married Mariana, he was marrying his dead brother's child. The age difference was 30 years, but that was the least problematic aspect of this union. Mariana of Austria arrived at the Spanish court in 1649, a fresh-faced 14-year-old ready to marry her 44-year-old uncle. The Spanish court welcomed her with all the enthusiasm of a funeral procession, which, given the Habsburg track record, was probably appropriate. The wedding was a magnificent affair, with all the pomp and circumstance befitting the union of uncle and niece. The guests smiled and applauded, though privately they were probably wondering if they were attending a wedding or a very expensive genetic experiment. Mariana was not a beautiful woman by the standards of her time, or any time really. The Habsburg features were already well established by her generation: the jutting jaw, the drooping lower lip, the slightly vacant stare that suggested the lights were on but nobody was home. But beauty was irrelevant in royal marriages. What mattered was bloodline purity, and by God, Mariana's blood was so pure it was practically distilled. The consummation of the marriage was delayed until Mariana was 15, which was considered appropriately respectful by 17th century standards. Philip IV, meanwhile, was busy running an empire that stretched from Spain to the Philippines, though running might be too generous a term. The Spanish Empire in the mid-1600s was less of a well-oiled machine and more of a creaking, groaning contraption held together with prayer, gold from the Americas, and sheer Habsburg stubbornness. When Mariana finally became pregnant, the court held its collective breath. Producing a male heir was the primary job of any queen, but producing a healthy male heir was the challenge when your family tree resembled a DNA knot. Mariana's first pregnancy ended in miscarriage, as did her second. The third pregnancy produced a daughter, Maria Theresa, who survived, but would later be married off to Louis XIV of France, presumably to dilute the Habsburg genetics with some fresh French blood. The pressure on Mariana was enormous. She was the queen of the most powerful empire in the world, But her most important job was to produce a son who could inherit that empire and continue the Habsburg line. The irony, of course, was that the very purity of Habsburg blood that made her suitable for marriage was also making it nearly impossible for her to produce healthy children. Court physicians, those medieval masters of medical malpractice, had theories about Mariana's fertility problems. Some blamed her diet, others her exercise routine. Still others suggested she wasn't praying hard enough. None of them dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, marrying your uncle wasn't the optimal reproductive strategy. That would have been blasphemy, treason, and probably several other capital offences rolled into one convenient accusation. Mariana tried everything. She consulted doctors, midwives, astrologers, and priests. She changed her diet, her prayers, her sleeping position. She wore special amulets, drank questionable potions, and submitted to medical procedures that were probably more dangerous than helpful. The Spanish court watched and waited, placing bets on whether the queen would produce an heir or simply expire from the effort. In 1657, Mariana became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy proceeded normally, or as normally as any Habsburg pregnancy could. She didn't miscarry in the first trimester, which was already cause for celebration. She didn't miscarry in the second trimester, which had the court physicians cautiously optimistic. By the third trimester, preparations were being made for the birth of a prince. The royal birthing chamber was prepared with all the medieval splendor that Spanish royalty could muster. Tapestries depicting biblical scenes of birth and fertility adorned the walls. Religious relics were placed strategically around the room to ensure divine protection. The finest midwives in Spain were summoned to attend the queen, along with court physicians who had read every available text on obstetrics, which in the 17th century meant they knew approximately nothing useful. Philip IV paced the corridors of the palace, probably contemplating the irony that he could conquer kingdoms, but couldn't ensure the birth of a healthy son. The Spanish nobles gathered in antechambers, whispering prayers and placing final bets on the child's gender and chances of survival. The entire machinery of the Spanish Empire held its breath. Labor began on a cold November morning in 1661. Mariana's screams echoed through the palace corridors, which was considered perfectly normal for royal births. Medieval obstetrics operated on the principle that childbirth should be as painful and dangerous as possible, presumably to test the mother's worthiness. Mariana labored for hours, attended by midwives who offered encouragement, physicians who offered theories, and priests who offered prayers. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of medieval medical intervention, the child was born, a son, the heir to the Spanish Empire, the future Charles Sicker of Spain. The midwives cleaned him off, wrapped him in royal swaddling clothes, and presented him to his mother with the traditional announcement, "Your Majesty, God has blessed Spain with a prince." And Mariana looked down at her son, and probably experienced the maternal equivalent of buyer's remorse. Charles Sicken was not a healthy baby. He was not even a normal baby. He was what happened when generations of genetic roulette finally came up snake eyes. The child's head was grotesquely oversized, a condition that would be diagnosed today as hydrocephalus, but was then attributed to royal dignity. His jaw jutted forward so dramatically that he would never be able to properly close his mouth or chew solid food. His tongue was so large that speech would always be difficult and often incomprehensible. His limbs were weak and malformed, suggesting that walking would be a challenge he might never fully master. But the most disturbing aspect of the newborn Charles II was his eyes. They had the vacant, unfocused stare of someone who was present in body but not entirely in mind. Even as an infant, it was clear that Charles II was not operating with a full deck of chromosomes. The court physicians examined the baby and declared him healthy, because telling the king that his newborn heir was a genetic disaster was not conducive to long life or steady employment. They pronounced him vigorous, well, formed, and destined for greatness. The Spanish court celebrated with the enthusiasm of people trying very hard to convince themselves that everything was fine. Word of the prince's birth spread throughout Europe with the speed of 17th century communication, which is to say it took weeks to reach the major capitals. Other royal courts sent congratulations and gifts. while privately their ambassadors sent coded messages describing the new Spanish heir in terms that ranged from diplomatic concern to barely concealed horror. Mariana, meanwhile, was experiencing the unique joy of maternal bonding with a child who seemed to belong more to a medical textbook than a royal nursery. Charles sick, I couldn't nurse properly due to his malformed jaw and oversized tongue. He couldn't lift his head or support his own weight. His crying was constant and piercing, the sound of an infant in perpetual discomfort. The Queen hired wet nurses, but Charles Sire had difficulty feeding from any source. His digestive system, like the rest of his body, was poorly constructed. He vomited frequently, couldn't gain weight properly, and showed little interest in the world around him. The royal physicians prescribed various treatments, all of which were useless and most of which were actively harmful. Philip IV visited his son regularly, though these visits were probably more obligation than pleasure. The king was 66 years old when Charles Sire was born, and he had seen enough Habsburg children to recognize the signs of genetic disaster. He loved his son in the way that parents love damaged children, with a mixture of fierce protectiveness and quiet despair. The Spanish court adapted to the reality of Charles II's condition with the flexibility of people who had no choice in the matter. Servants were trained to handle a child who couldn't control his bodily functions or coordinate his movements. Tutors were hired to attempt an education that would have been challenging for a normal child and was nearly impossible for Charles Sire. As Charles C. grew, or failed to grow properly, his condition became more apparent to everyone at court. By age 4, he still couldn't walk without assistance. By age 6, he could barely speak. By age 8, it was clear that he would never be the kind of king who could lead armies into battle or negotiate complex treaties with foreign powers. But Charles Asiku was the heir to the Spanish throne, and in the Habsburg system, bloodline trumped competence every time. The Spanish Empire would be inherited by a man who couldn't chew solid food, couldn't speak clearly, and couldn't walk across a room without help. This was the inevitable result of centuries of genetic inbreeding, the final masterpiece of Habsburg matrimonial strategy. Mariana watched her son's development with the resignation of a woman who had done her dynastic duty, and was now living with the consequences. She had produced the required male heir, and if that heir happened to be a walking advertisement for genetic diversity, well, that was God's will. Or genetics. In the 17th century, the distinction was often unclear. The Queen's relationship with Charles Sikkim was complicated by the fact that he required constant care and attention. Normal royal children were raised by nurses and tutors, with parents maintaining a dignified distance. Charles Asiku needed his mother's constant intervention to survive. Mariana found herself functioning more as a caregiver than a queen, managing her son's medical needs while trying to maintain the facade of royal dignity. Philip IV died in 1665, when Charles II was just 4 years old. The Spanish throne passed to a child who couldn't tie his own shoes, much less rule an empire. Mariana became regent, which meant she was effectively running Spain, while trying to keep her severely disabled son alive and functional enough to maintain the illusion of royal authority. The regency was a challenging period for both mother and son. Spain was facing economic decline, military defeats, and political instability, while being nominally ruled by a child who couldn't count to 10 or recognize his own reflection. Mariana managed affairs of state during the day and tended to Charles Espoo's medical needs at night, functioning as both queen regent and specialized nurse. European courts watched the Spanish situation with fascination and horror. Ambassadors sent regular reports on Charles II's condition, describing his inability to walk properly, his incomprehensible speech, and his frequent seizures. Foreign powers began to calculate how they might benefit from Spain's inevitable weakness under such a ruler. Charles Asiku's education was attempted by a series of increasingly desperate tutors. Teaching him to read was nearly impossible due to his vision problems and cognitive limitations. Teaching him mathematics was abandoned entirely. Teaching him languages was pointless, since he could barely speak Spanish. The tutors focused on basic life skills, eating without choking, walking without falling, sitting upright during official ceremonies. The Spanish nobility adapted to their future king's limitations with varying degrees of success. Some embraced the situation, recognizing that a weak king might mean more power for the nobility. Others despaired at the thought of Spain being led by someone who couldn't lead himself to the bathroom without assistance. Most simply accepted it as another manifestation of God's mysterious plan for the Habsburg dynasty. Religious authorities declared Charles Cephal's condition to be a test of faith, a divine challenge that would ultimately strengthen the Spanish spirit. They organized special prayers for the king's health and commissioned religious artwork depicting him as a holy figure whose suffering was spiritually significant. This was the 17th century equivalent of putting a positive spin on a public relations disaster. As Charles Cyr reached adolescence, new problems emerged. His sexual development was abnormal, which raised questions about his ability to produce an heir and continue the Habsburg line. Court physicians examined him regularly and reported their findings in euphemistic language that couldn't quite disguise the extent of his reproductive disabilities. The question of marriage became pressing as Charles Sickon approached his teens. European royal families were reluctant to offer their daughters to a man who was clearly incapable of normal marital relations, but the Spanish throne was still valuable enough to attract interest. Negotiations began for a marriage that would be more political alliance than romantic union. Marie-Louise d'Orléans, niece of Louis XIV of France, was eventually selected as Charles's bride. The choice was political rather than personal. Louis XIV wanted to establish French influence in Spain, and marrying his niece to the Spanish king was an efficient way to accomplish this goal. The fact that the Spanish king was barely functional was an inconvenience to be managed rather than an obstacle to be overcome. The wedding of Charles Tecker and Marie-Louise in 1679 was a spectacle of royal pageantry designed to distract from the groom's obvious disabilities. Charles C., now 18 years old, could barely stand during the ceremony and had to be supported by attendants. His speech during the vows was so garbled that most guests couldn't understand what he was saying. Marie-Louise, 15 years old and probably terrified, went through the motions with the stoic resignation of someone fulfilling a political obligation. The marriage was never consummated, which surprised no one who had observed Charles II's condition. Marie-Louise found herself married to a man who was more patient than husband, more medical case than romantic partner. She adapted to her situation by developing interests in art, literature, and court intrigue, while maintaining the public pretense of a normal royal marriage. Mariana watched her son's marriage with the mixed emotions of a mother who had managed to arrange a dynastic alliance, while knowing it would never produce the grandchildren that would secure the Habsburg succession. The Spanish court celebrated the wedding with appropriate ceremony, while privately acknowledging that this marriage was unlikely to solve the succession crisis. Charles VI's reign, which began officially when he reached majority, was characterized by continued decline in Spanish power and influence. He couldn't make decisive military decisions, couldn't negotiate complex diplomatic agreements, and couldn't provide the strong leadership that the Spanish Empire needed. Spain lost territories, prestige, and economic strength while being nominally ruled by a king who couldn't rule himself. The king's daily routine was managed by a team of servants, physicians, and advisors who functioned as a collective prosthetic monarchy. They dressed him, fed him, transported him to official ceremonies, and interpreted his wishes to visiting dignitaries. Charles II became less a ruler than a royal puppet, manipulated by others who wielded power in his name. Marie-Louise died suddenly in 1689, possibly from poisoning, though the cause was never definitively established. Her death eliminated any remaining hope that Charles I might produce an heir through his first marriage. The Spanish court immediately began searching for a second wife, though finding a European princess willing to marry Charles II was increasingly difficult as word of his condition spread. Mariana of Neuburg was eventually selected as Charles II's second wife. She was a German princess whose family needed the political alliance more than they feared the personal consequences of marrying their daughter to a severely disabled king. The second marriage was even more obviously political than the first, with both parties understanding that romantic love was not part of the arrangement. The second marriage also failed to produce children, confirming what court physicians had long suspected: Charles VI was incapable of reproduction. The Habsburg line that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries would end with him. The genetic experiment, that had produced increasingly disabled rulers had finally created one so damaged that he couldn't even attempt to continue the bloodline. Mariana of Austria died in 1696, having spent 35 years as queen and queen regent, managing Spain's affairs while caring for her genetically compromised son. Her death left Charles II even more dependent on advisors and servants, though by this point he was more royal mascot than functional monarch. The final years of Charles II's reign were marked by increasing frailty and obvious mental deterioration. He suffered from frequent seizures, periods of unconsciousness, and episodes of bizarre behavior that suggested his already limited mental capacity was further declining. European powers began openly discussing the Spanish succession, treating Charles II as if he were already dead. The king's last will and testament, written with the assistance of advisors who understood the political implications better than Charles II, understood his own condition, named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, as his heir. This decision would eventually lead to the War of Spanish Succession, as other European powers disputed French claims to Spanish territories. Charles died on November 1, 1700, at the age of 38. His death was probably a relief to everyone involved, including himself. He had lived his entire life as a prisoner of his own genetics, unable to function normally in any aspect of human existence. His death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and the beginning of Bourbon rule in Spain. The autopsy of Charles II, performed by court physicians who were finally free to speak honestly about his condition, revealed the full extent of his genetic damage. His organs were severely malformed, his brain was abnormally small, and his reproductive system was so underdeveloped that conception would have been impossible, even under optimal circumstances. Modern genetic analysis of Habsburg family records suggests that Charles II's coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that typically found in children of full siblings. Generations of cousin marriages had produced a genetic concentration that was incompatible with normal human development. Charles II was not just disabled, he was the predictable result of a genetic experiment that had been running for centuries. The Spanish court that had spent decades pretending Charles II was a normal king finally acknowledged the reality of his condition. Courtiers who had spent their careers interpreting his mumbled words and managing his disabilities could finally admit that they had been serving a king who was barely functional as a human being. European historians who had carefully documented Charles II's reign in diplomatic language could finally describe what they had actually witnessed. The slow-motion collapse of a great empire ruled by a man whose genetics had betrayed him before birth. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty had not fallen to foreign conquest or political revolution. It had been destroyed by its own obsession with bloodline purity. Marie-Louise and Mariana of Neuburg, Charles XI's two queens, had both essentially been widows while married, united to a man who could never function as a husband in any meaningful sense. They had fulfilled their political obligations while sacrificing any hope of normal married life, becoming caretakers rather than wives, diplomatic symbols rather than romantic partners. The Spanish Empire itself had suffered under Charles C's reign, losing territories and influence, while being nominally ruled by someone incapable of making strategic decisions. Spain's decline during this period was not merely political or economic, it was the inevitable result of being governed by someone whose genetic inheritance had made effective leadership impossible. The broader European balance of power had been affected by Charles II's condition as other nations adjusted their strategies to account for Spanish weakness. France gained influence, England and Holland expanded their maritime empires, and Austria pursued its own territorial ambitions, all while Spain struggled under the burden of a genetically compromised monarchy. The Catholic Church, which had supported the Habsburg dynasty for centuries, found itself defending a king whose condition raised uncomfortable questions about divine approval and genetic predestination. Religious authorities had to explain how God's chosen royal family could produce such obviously flawed rulers, leading to theological discussions that became increasingly complex and unsatisfying. The medical community of the 17th century, limited by their understanding of genetics and human development, could only describe Charles II's symptoms without comprehending their cause. Court physicians spent decades treating conditions that were actually genetic disorders, using medieval remedies for problems that could only be solved by genetic diversity. Spanish literature and art from Charles VII's reign reflected the cultural impact of having a severely disabled king. Writers and artists had to navigate the challenge of celebrating royal majesty while dealing with a monarch who was obviously not majestic in any conventional sense. The result was a cultural period marked by increasing artificiality and detachment from reality. The common people of Spain, who rarely saw their king in person, learned about Charles VII's condition through rumours and gossip that probably exaggerated his disabilities while understating the political consequences. They lived through economic decline and military defeats while being told they were subjects of a great king, creating a disconnect between royal propaganda and observable reality. Foreign ambassadors who had to conduct diplomatic business with Charles VI developed elaborate protocols for managing interactions with a king who couldn't understand complex negotiations or remember important details. Diplomacy became a form of theatre, with real business conducted through intermediaries while maintaining the fiction of royal authority. The Spanish military, which had once been the most formidable force in Europe, struggled to maintain effectiveness while being nominally commanded by someone who couldn't mount a horse or hold a sword. Military leadership had to work around their king's limitations while preserving the appearance of royal command. Economic advisors who tried to explain fiscal policy to Charles II found themselves dealing with someone who couldn't understand basic mathematical concepts or remember financial information from one day to the next. Spain's economic decline accelerated partly because effective financial management was impossible when the ultimate authority couldn't comprehend the issues involved. The Spanish legal system had to adapt to having a king who couldn't understand legal concepts or make judicial decisions. Court cases that required royal judgment were effectively decided by advisors who then attributed their decisions to Charles VI, creating a legal fiction that preserved royal authority while acknowledging its practical absence. Religious ceremonies involving Charles VI became exercises in careful choreography, with priests and attendants ensuring that the king could participate without embarrassing himself or the institution of monarchy. Royal religious duties were simplified and managed to accommodate someone with severe cognitive and physical limitations. The international marriage market for European royalty was affected by the Habsburg example, as other royal families began to reconsider the wisdom of too close intermarriage. Charles VI's condition served as a warning about the genetic risks of maintaining bloodline purity above all other considerations. Scientific understanding of heredity, while still primitive in the 17th century, began to develop partly in response to observations of the Habsburg dynasty's increasing disabilities. Charles II became an unwitting case study in the importance of genetic diversity, though the scientific vocabulary to properly describe his condition wouldn't exist for centuries. The Protestant Reformation's critique of Catholic monarchy found additional ammunition in Charles II's condition, as Protestant theologians argued that his disabilities proved God's disapproval of Catholic royal claims. Religious warfare took on genetic dimensions as different Christian denominations interpreted Habsburg decline as divine judgment. Art patronage during Charles Tulliwi's reign reflected the challenge of depicting a king who was not physically or mentally impressive. Court artists developed techniques for suggesting royal majesty while avoiding realistic representation of their subject, leading to increasingly abstract and symbolic royal portraiture. The concept of royal divine right became more difficult to maintain when the divinely appointed king was obviously incapable of effective rule. Political theorists had to develop new justifications for monarchical authority that could accommodate severely disabled rulers while preserving the theoretical basis of royal power. Charles I's death in 1700 marked not just the end of a reign or a dynasty, but the conclusion of a genetic experiment that had lasted for centuries. The Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity had produced increasingly disabled rulers, until it finally created one so damaged that he couldn't even attempt to continue the family line. The War of Spanish Succession that followed Charles I's death was fought partly over the question of who could legitimately inherit an empire that had been nearly destroyed by genetic mismanagement. European powers battled for control of Spanish territories, while the Spanish people struggled to recover from decades of ineffective rule. Modern historians studying the Habsburg dynasty can trace the genetic deterioration that led to Charles' sickened condition, mapping the increasing frequency of cousin marriages and the accumulating genetic damage they produced. The Habsburg family tree serves as a cautionary tale about the biological consequences of political breeding strategies. Medical geneticists examining historical records of the Habsburg dynasty have identified the specific genetic disorders that affected Charles Tsiwi and his relatives, demonstrating how recessive genetic traits became concentrated through generations of inbreeding. Charles' Tsiwi's condition represents multiple genetic disorders occurring simultaneously in one unfortunate individual. The Spanish Empire's recovery under Bourbon rule demonstrated how quickly effective leadership could restore national strength, suggesting that Spain's decline under Charles VII was primarily due to governmental dysfunction rather than fundamental national weakness. The country had the resources and population to be powerful. It lacked only competent leadership. Educational institutions, established during Charles VI's reign, had to develop methods for teaching and administration that didn't require royal oversight. Since the king couldn't provide meaningful guidance or direction, Spanish universities and schools became more autonomous out of necessity, inadvertently promoting intellectual independence. The economic policies implemented during Charles II's reign were largely shaped by advisors who had to work without meaningful royal input, leading to financial management that was sometimes effective despite rather than because of royal authority. Spain's economic problems were complicated but not caused by having an incapacitated ruler. Military strategy during the latter years of Habsburg rule had to account for the impossibility of royal battlefield leadership, forcing Spanish commanders to develop more decentralized command structures. The military became more professional partly because royal military leadership had become impossible. Diplomatic relations with other European powers were conducted through elaborate charades that preserved the fiction of royal negotiation, while actual decisions were made by advisors who understood both Charles Killsgley's limitations and Spain's strategic needs. Diplomacy became more bureaucratic and less personal during this period. The cultural impact of Charles II's reign extended beyond Spain, as other European courts observed the consequences of extreme inbreeding and began to modify their own marriage practices. The Habsburg example influenced royal breeding strategies throughout Europe, promoting greater genetic diversity in subsequent generations. Charles II's legacy is ultimately one of genetic tragedy and political dysfunction, a cautionary tale about the biological limits of political theory. His life demonstrated that bloodline purity, taken to extremes, could destroy the very dynasties it was meant to preserve. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty collapsed, not from external pressure, but from internal genetic decay. The queen who birthed this monster, Mariana of Austria, lived to see the consequences of centuries of Habsburg breeding practices. She had fulfilled her dynastic duty by producing a male heir, but that heir was so genetically damaged that he effectively ended the dynasty she was meant to continue. Her story is one of maternal duty in the face of genetic disaster, royal obligation despite personal cost. And so ends the tale of the Habsburg genetic experiment, a centuries-long project that began with the reasonable goal of maintaining political control through strategic marriage and ended with the birth of a king who could barely function as a human being. Charles VI was not an aberration or an accident. He was the inevitable result of a system that prioritized bloodline purity over biological reality. The monster that emerged from Queen Mariana's womb in 1661 was not the product of supernatural forces or divine displeasure. It was the predictable outcome of genetic mathematics, the final calculation in a dynasty's long experiment with inbreeding. Charles VI of Spain stands as history's most dramatic example of what happens when political ambition ignores biological reality, when keeping power in the family becomes more important than keeping the family functional. In the end, the Habsburgs got exactly what they bred for. A king whose blood was so pure, so concentrated, so undiluted by outside genetic material that it could no longer sustain life in any meaningful way. They had succeeded in creating a ruler who was 100% Habsburg and U% capable. Mission accomplished.